G'day everyone, Kate from the Narrate team here. This podcast is the last message in Narrate's Toxic Views series. Adam looks at our views on evangelism and the opportunities to become more genuine in our approach to sharing God's grace with others.
Happy Super Bowl Sunday. Is there a game today? I'm not even sure that there is one. There's a lot of Seahawks fans here. I'm so excited we're here to talk about Jesus. Just kidding. So this morning we are going to finish up this conversation that we started a while ago called Toxic Views. And just in case you haven't been with us, maybe ever, if you haven't ever been with us, welcome. That's an honor. We started this series the 1st of January, and really we started by just trying to acknowledge a couple things simultaneously, and they're not easy things to acknowledge. First of all, we just tried to allow that there's perhaps nothing more repulsive than someone telling you that your view of God is all wrong and theirs is perfect. And that just gets gross fast. And yet at the same time, what we've been trying to talk about in this series is that it's quite possible, not possible even, but likely, that each and every one of us, whether you consider yourself a follower of Jesus or some other religion, or you don't consider yourself anything, that it's quite possible and actually it's going to happen that you're going to develop a view of God's character that's wrong and that's toxic. And see, part of the deal is we often talk about God from these kind of distant, almost superficial, abstract ways. But when we begin to analyze his character, what we've recognized is anytime you misunderstand someone's character, the result is it fleshes out in your life in some kind of gross ways. And so this has been a series that really the design was to push the onus really back onto us, back onto you, and just to begin to challenge you and provoke you to go, are you as familiar with Jesus as maybe you think that you are? And might a fresh read of the Gospels provoke you to rethink his character? And might that address some of your own desires for change? So that's where we started, and then we kind of just started to take a swing at some toxic views of God that you may hold, mostly just to reinforce this process. And we talked about getting safe wrong. First we talked about getting God wrong, and then we talked about getting safe wrong. And then most recently, we talked about getting why wrong. And this morning, I want to talk about getting evangelism wrong. Now, I know that's that's a big word, and probably a word that whether you follow Jesus or not, you don't even care to use very much. Maybe you've never even heard the word. But it just felt to me like as a church family that there's some conversations that we need to have, and recognizing that it's Super Bowl Sunday, we thought this might be a really appropriate Sunday to talk about something that is kind of a churchy thing and kind of an insider thing. But if you don't follow Jesus, or even if you do, really when we talk about evangelism, what we're talking about is talking about God. This morning what I want to explore is what is your view of talking about God at work, with friends, with family, with your kids? Like what does that look like? Because I'm sure there's not a person in the room that isn't well aware of the fact that it gets gross very, very quickly. And yet, even though it can get really, really gross, it's also pretty important. And so this morning, I just want to talk about how is it that we communicate with people about God in a way that's welcomed, not forced, in a way that's a blessing, not a curse. I have a friend who, I think it illustrates how backwards and bad it can get. He lives in Elliston, and he spent a weekend putting a new screen door up, or a day. I don't think he's as bad of a craftsman as me. It would take me a weekend. It took him a few hours. He put a new screen door up in his house, left. I don't know whether he went to a dinner with his wife or whatever, came back, and his door was beat to oblivion, like kind of halfway on the hinges, bent up. He had a railing next to his door, and the wind had caught the door, because somebody didn't latch the screen door, and it had just beat against his railing for several hours, and so the thing was ruined. And when he saw it, he couldn't believe it. And then he looked at the handle, and there was a tract rubber banded to the handle of his screen door. Kind of captures all of it, doesn't it? Like, that's ironic, and I'm sure that was good for his relationship with Jesus. Wow. So I want to jump into that this morning, and partially because it's part of our heritage. Some of you probably know us as Narrate. Many of you know us as Narrate Church. But do you know how the federal government knows us? We don't even tell prospective staff members this until they've worked with us for 6 months. You know what our technical legal name with the federal government and the state government is? It's Narrate Evangelical Church of the Evangelical Churches of North America. Doesn't it just roll off the tongue? It's NEC of the ECNA. Like, we get like statements from the federal government. It doesn't even fit. I mean, it doesn't even come close to fitting. So you can use that, because I know we've been keeping this from you, and you've been inviting friends to church, and they're like, nah, Narrate's too weird. And so now you can say, well, it's not actually Narrate, it's Narrate Evangelical Church of the Evangelical Churches of North America. And it sounds nothing like a gentleman's club from 1955, right? I mean, I'm sure women are allowed there, even though the name doesn't necessarily imply that. Now, there's lots of things we could say. We're a part of an association of churches, a family of churches, most notably Journey in Bozeman and Harvest in Billings, who helped plant this. And for federal registration reasons, it's just easier for us to be a part of that family. That's part of it. But it also speaks to our heritage. And we talked a little bit about this in September. But it speaks to the reality that we stand on the shoulders of women and men who, some decades ago had a passion for talking about their faith. And I think what's really easy, especially for those of us in our 20s and 30s, is to develop this mindset of history that says they were old-fashioned and got it all wrong, and we've got it right. And I guess this morning I want to step into this conversation knowing that this is a conversation that's decades old for our little association, that's a couple millennia old for people who have been following Jesus. And though it often has lots of ridiculous stories like screen doors getting beat against railings, it almost always comes with good intentions. We stand on the shoulders of people who thought long and hard about how do we do this? But it can get expressed weird. How many of you remember a guy named Roland Stewart? Anybody recognize that name? If you're less than 30, you probably don't, but Roland Stewart, also known as the Rainbow Man. If you have some memory of some guy behind a goalpost somewhere holding a John 3:16 sign, that's him. Roland, in the late 1970s, had an experience with Jesus himself and decided that he was going to share Jesus with the world, but that he was going to use national TV to do that. And so with his rainbow-colored wig, oftentimes a sign or a T-shirt that said Jesus saves or John 3:16, he developed a habit of placing himself at nationally televised sporting events in ways that were unavoidable. The Simpsons even created a mockery of him. Now, you can read his story. His story doesn't end well, incidentally. His first appearance was at the 1977 NBA Finals. From there, TV executives began to figure out this guy, and they decided that it was kind of this reverse Where's Waldo game, because he was trying to get on TV, and they were trying to keep him off TV, but he just had this way of ending up places. At one point, he placed himself behind the pit crew of the Indianapolis 500 winning pit team. Another instance, at some prominent football games behind goalposts. Roland Stewart was an evangelist. And I think for many of the people that we love and go to school and work with, maybe some of you here, maybe all of us here, he kind of also embodies the weirdness of this thing called evangelism. There's another guy who, despite his best of intentions, does this. Did you know, now some of you may remember that there's a quarterback that came before Peyton Manning who actually has a better playoff winning percentage than Peyton Manning? Anybody remember his name? It's Tim Tebow. Turns out he's 1 for 1. Just saying. Or 1 and 1, not 1 for 1. Is it 1 and 1? Is that right? Yeah. Batting 500. Peyton Manning. And anyway, so did you know, some of you remember that game against the Pittsburgh Steelers, that ridiculous game where they didn't stand a chance. Do you know that's called the 3:16 game? I'll just remind you of the game first, and then we'll talk about some of the weirdness of that. Go ahead to that next slide. Remember this? I do, because my wife was in Superman on the living room floor shouting at the top of her lungs. It's very disturbing. Remember Champ Bailey beat him down the sideline? Remember? And then this is the best part. We'll watch this and then we'll make it stop. You know how much that must have pained Dan Marino to do that? Oh, man. They paid him a bonus that day for that. Now, bless his heart. Okay, let's make it stop. Just saying, though, Patriots did the same thing to Tebow that they do to Manning. So I didn't know this, but as I was searching Roland Stewart, I bumped into, if you go to Wikipedia, that game is called the 3:16 game. Why? Because some nut jobs, in my opinion, they've found all these, sorry, that's maybe not the best phrase, but just here's some of the statistics. Tebow passed for 316 yards that day. Tebow fans are going, that's a miracle. I know. His average completed pass was 31.6. The game's only interception thrown by Ben Roethlisberger, because Tebow missed all the defenders, the game's only interception was thrown by Ben Roethlisberger on 3rd and 16. The TV ratings, they peaked in overtime at 31.6% of American households. It's insane. And the game was on the 3rd anniversary of that famous BCS National Championship game where Tebow came out, remember, with the 316 eye black? 3rd year anniversary. And just to show that I think this is ridiculous, that the final correlation that those who say there is one, that there's their evidence, I don't know that this would stand up in the court of law, but their evidence is that both the Broncos coach, John Fox, and their executive vice president, John Elway's first name was John. Horrible. Now, let me ask you this. Because I think one of the things about this whole conversation is mocking Tebow and mocking those other guys. That's one thing. But how comfortable are you with this idea of evangelism? How resolved are you in your convictions as to what that looks like to talk to God, talk to your friends about God? How comfortable are you acknowledging God and his presence in your life, suggesting that a friend maybe attend church or read a certain book? I would guess that for many of us, that there's a season where you're a lot more comfortable with it than you are today. I think this is part of the makeup of this place. It's part of our DNA. I know that's the case for me. I was thinking back to my first semester in college. I didn't start for a couple years. It took me that long to find one that would accept me. And I was sitting in this class. It was an intro to education class. I have a secondary ed degree. It was taught by a guy named Dr. Madden. He was in his 70s, a veteran of the staff. He started the class, and in hindsight, it was the type of class that they want freshmen to take to kind of get them to think about life and to think about healthy living and things like that. And so it was a bit of a philosophy, kind of purpose of life, kind of driven class. And he started the first lecture by saying something like, life is meaningless. There's no good reason why we're here. Your only thing you can do is derive as much pleasure as you possibly can. Eventually, you're going to get sick, and then you're going to die, and that's that. And he kind of provoked us to disagree. Now, in hindsight, I think he was fishing for an evangelical, and I took the bait. I immediately raised my hand, and in the young zeal of just a couple-year-old Christ follower, in my mind, shared the truth. And for the rest of the semester, there was lively debate in the class because I took every hook he threw me. And by the end of the semester, I would have swore I was the only Christ follower in the class. And today I go, no, I was the only one that was acting like an idiot, and the rest of them were embarrassed by me, and they didn't want anything to do with my antics. I'm guessing you can relate that perhaps there was a time in your past where you were far too eager, and maybe that's why you're so reluctant now. That next summer, I worked with a guy named Justin. Again, it's funny how a little bit of time gives some perspective. He was in his late 20s. I was a temp at an engineering firm. He was hired as a temp as an engineer at the engineering firm. His wife had recently left him for another man. He had a couple young kids. He had nothing. And he came to work, and I gathered that he was somewhat receptive to the God conversation, and a friend had recently given me a list of like the 60 best evangelism questions you could ask, and I kind of thumbed through that and found one that I thought might work on him, and we were driving to a job site one day, and I said, hey, Justin, I'm worried about you. He was like, what are you worried about? I'll be okay. And I was like, no, I know you'll be okay, but like you're pretty young, healthy. I know you got some tough stuff going on, but you also have a lot good going on. He said, so why are you worried about me? And I just said, because I'm afraid you're going to hell. I mean, that was a great conversation from there. It wasn't awkward at all. I'm guessing many of you can relate, and the result is you kind of just sit on your hands a lot today. Some of you, maybe you've never been comfortable. I was talking with someone whom I have a lot of respect for recently, and actually I was one of the things I was talking with him about was he does some volunteer stuff around here, but it's in a pretty specialized field, and I was trying to be sensitive to the fact that maybe we're abusing your volunteer muscle, and he was quick to assure me, no, I love doing this, and he made this comment, and actually this is why we're doing this message, because it just stuck in my heart. He said, I can do that, like that's my chance, this is my chance to do something tangible. And I don't even know that he's aware that he said this, but then he said, but I don't talk with my friends about Jesus. I don't share God with anybody. I can do that. And I walked away from that, and it just, how some things just stick in that recording device in your brain. And I frankly was sad that my friend feels what I'm perceiving as a certain level of guilt or shame for not doing that. See, when it comes to this whole conversation, it seems that like so many things, we're prone to one of two extremes, doesn't it? We go to youth group, and some of you have been down that road, and you kind of acquire the fire and dare to share, and there's this kind of like, everybody rise up, and they don't give you a sword because that would be too freaky, but more or less that's the way you're behaving. And there's this like, I share Jesus with everybody I know, but they didn't want to hear it. Doesn't matter. I still get to check the box. And there's this crazy thing, right? And yet there's another extreme, and I don't know what it is, but it seems like, and I suppose none of us think of ourselves as extremists, but the other one is just, no, never. Because I don't want to be that gal. I don't want anybody that I work with to think that our friendship is contingent upon that. I don't want anyone to feel like a second-class citizen because they don't agree with me spiritually. And I guess this morning, what I want to delve into, there's a little bit of research that's been helpful to me in this, but I want to delve into what I want to arrogantly and yet confidently say maybe is a middle ground. To talk about like how can we not be crazy zealous and like beat up screen doors, and at the same time be confident that we'll identify the right moment. That it won't be about us and our antics and our tactics and our statistics, but it'll be about the people that we love, and we'll know when it's the right time to make mention of something. Because it strikes me, we do have this desire to share something, but sometimes we just don't even know what that something is. I want to read to you a letter that I received last Sunday. Last Sunday was a bit of a blur. It was handed to me by an usher. It was put in the offering. I received it I received it between gatherings. I kind of forgot about it. Got home. Our whole family had been in that kind of sick triage kind of thing for about a week. And so at one point, Teresa's like, we need to go for a walk. And so I was getting ready to go for a walk, and I was emptying my pockets, and I found this letter. And let me just start by saying I already received this person's permission to share this. And we even have it on the screen. You can follow along, but let me just read this to you. It says, Hey, Adam, I'm a student at Carroll and have been attending Narrate for the last year or so and wanted to say thank you for such a welcoming church. Now, let me just say that anytime I hear Adam, I hear you. It's not about me. I get that. It's about ushers and setup and all that stuff. It's been so beneficial for me, and I've learned so much from all your sermons. I recently lost my brother in a car accident and received money in the process, and I've been thinking about how he would want me to use it. I felt the need to give back to your church and show how much I appreciate everything you guys do. I was thinking you could use $1,000 for you and your family and $500 for the church needs. I hope you have a blessed year. Thanks again. Now, a couple of caveats. Unfortunately, this is necessary. I've already talked with her and explained to her, like, we have a great council who takes really good care of the staff, and so all that $1,500 just goes into the general fund. That's what allows us to rent ski buses and send students to Butte and things like that. And I've had the chance to ask her, like, are you grieving your brother appropriately? Are you getting help? But really the question I want to ask you is this. If you had a copy of this, how proudly would you share it? Like, how quick would you be to tell this story? If you had the image, if you could put it on how, do you see the difference? I read that letter and immediately called the boys around, and I was like, you guys, you got to hear this. And listen, they're PKs. It's weird, and so I have a hard time figuring out what those moments are and what to say and what not to say. But I was like, there's 100% of me. I want them to hear this. Immediately sent it off to the staff, like, you guys, you've got to hear this. Which raises this question for me, why is it that a story like that is something that, without feeling creepy or weird at all, we would so quickly go like, I'm telling that one. I would feel no shame telling that. Yeah, there's a few caveats that we got to kind of offer, and there's some things we got to unpack, but that's amazing. A college girl. I mean, that's like the widow's mites. $1,500 from a college girl? And it's not about the money, is it? What is it? See, I would argue, and I think this is the key in what I want to circle around several different ways this morning. I would argue that she's a gal who found God to be helpful. And we love sharing stories when people just find God to be helpful. In fact, I'll bet you your story started with a God who stepped into your life and demonstrated himself helpful. Something about life worked with him there. I was thinking this week just about those disciples whose story John tells us in the first part of his story. And I wondered if their story might parallel yours. You know, John gives us detail about a few of the disciples and how they started following Jesus that no one else does. And the first one involves a guy named Andrew. And Andrew, he meets Jesus literally, like meets him, spends an afternoon with him, and then quickly goes, man, I think this is the Messiah. I think this is the one. I better go get my brother Simon. Simon shows up, and do you remember what Jesus said to him? Jesus looked at Simon, having seen him for the first time in this interaction, and says, you are Simon, son of John, but you'll be called Cephas, which means rock, which means rocky. Like y'all went to high school with a Rocky, right? This is Peter. His personality, he's Rocky. He's that guy who's way too quick to speak, always sticking his foot in his mouth, always getting out in front of his words, the one who always thinks he's right, who will never admit when he's wrong. He's Rocky. Didn't you go to high school with that guy? You know, the one that, you're Rocky. And it seems that part of what's going on here is Jesus goes, hey, Peter, I know you. I know the way you are. I know your antics. I know your personality. I know that your friends either love you or hate you. I know that you're self-assured to the degree that's annoying to everyone around you. I know that you're type A. Peter, I made you that way. And I'm going to use you. And all I can do is wonder if part of why Peter's life was so much different was because there was this day where he felt understood. And he felt assured that God made him and wanted to use him. If you have a relationship with Jesus, isn't that where your story started? Where this incredible assurance that despite all of your weaknesses and flaws and idiosyncrasies and personality, that God made you that way and that he wanted to use you. And wasn't that helpful? The exact same theme comes up in the ensuing story. Except for the next guy is of a completely different ilk. His name was Nathaniel. And you get the impression that Nathaniel was full of himself, that he was the type of Jew who was quick to acknowledge that he was the perfect Jewish person. Nathaniel comes walking around after already saying nothing good can come from Nazareth, which is kind of like, can anything good come from Butte? Nathaniel comes along. And Jesus says, I saw you while you were still under the fig tree. Before Philip called, sorry. Jesus says this. I messed this up. He says, here, and I just think you've got to hear sarcasm in this statement from Jesus. Here truly is an Israelite in whom there is no deceit. La-ti-da, here comes the great and mighty Nathaniel. You know, he's the perfect one, the one who's never messed up. And Jesus just calls it, like, yeah, I know you, Nathaniel. You're that guy who thinks that, and, you know, you fill in the blank with all kinds of weird sayings that we have about people. And Nathaniel looked at him. What does he say? Go ahead, next slide. He says, how do you know me? How do you know me? And Jesus says, well, I saw you under the fig tree. You were there. No, go back. You were there. And again, I don't know. That's sometimes the way interpretation works, but it sure seems to me that what was life-changing for Nathaniel was this assurance that who he was, God had made him that way. That there were things in his family of origin perhaps out of his control, that there was just certain tendencies and traits, and God was going, I know you, and I can use you. And I just wonder, isn't that where so many of our stories began? Broken. Maybe you'd tried everything you could to develop an identity. Maybe you'd pursued everything, and by the time you got to college, you just had this sense of like, I can't do this. And somehow someone helped you to see that Jesus could be helpful. Marriage was failing. Your health was failing. Your business was failing. You had an addiction. And somehow someone went, yeah. God knows you. He knows what's going on. And he can use you. It reminds me of that crazy guy who lived on the east shore of the Sea of Galilee. The one who lived in a time when there was no psychiatric medicine, let alone drugs, who was demon-possessed both literally and figuratively. And he was such a mess that the local town just kind of had to chain him up because they didn't know what to do with him. Afraid he would hurt them, afraid he would hurt himself. One day Jesus was walking along that shore. And I picture it like, remember when you were a kid and you would try to cut across someone's yard and you didn't know there was a dog on a chain, and the dog would and just get up right up to the edge of the chain. You're like, yeah. It seems like that's the interaction Jesus had with this guy. Like, he's kind of making his way, and this guy comes out of nowhere and just gets right in his grill. But he's not barking. He's just going crazy against Jesus. And Jesus delivers him, literally casts demons out of him. Remember, they go into these pigs. The pigs go into the water. They drown. The townspeople are freaking out because that's the way this stuff works. Is when you can't understand something, it's freaky. And so they ask Jesus to leave town. Remember that? And before he leaves, the guy says to Jesus, hey, could I go with you, please? Like, bring me with you. It's in Mark 5. And listen to what Jesus says. Jesus did not let him go. But he said, go home to your own people and tell them. Now, what do you suppose he's telling him to tell his own people? They're those made in 6 days, and I can prove it. They're 6 billion years old. What do you think he's telling them to say? Like some social political platform? Jesus is a Democrat. No, he's not. He's a Republican. What do you think he's telling him to go say? Listen to what Jesus says. Go home and tell them how much the Lord has done for you, and how he's had mercy on you. Just go tell him. Go tell your friends that God has been helpful despite what you deserve. Just go tell them that. You know that the first dedicated church building that they found, archaeologically speaking, was found in this town? And when the archaeologists, when the historians start asking the questions of what happened in this completely un-Jewish part of the world, how the bishop in the 3rd century was from this man's town, they quickly, and all they can do is speculate, is that it came back to this man who was crazy, who went and told people who wanted to know that God was helpful to him. See, my question is, what if it just gets a whole lot simpler if our message is God was helpful? My business was failing, my health was failing, my marriage wasn't working, I was just an emotional wreck, I was scared of the next phase of life, and God was helpful. You know, I was thinking about Dr. Madden this week, and it's funny how we retain facts and don't use them appropriately, but I was thinking about that professor I had. Simultaneously, his 40-something son was staying in his house under hospice care because he was dying of cancer. I wanted to debate the meaning of life. And no wonder he was asking those questions. He had a son who was dying an illogical death. And here I was, an arrogant college student who was going to debate him into Jesus. And I wish so much that instead I would have spent that energy going, I'm just going to look for an opportunity, if it presents itself, to suggest that maybe God could be helpful to him in this season. Maybe there's a good church that could help him explore those questions. My friend Justin, I mean, again, it's funny what makes sense to me now that didn't then. He was a 20-something father in the same situation as many of you in this room, whose wife left him for another man. He was distraught. And he was open to the conversation of God. I remember going to Barnes & Noble and buying him a Bible. I remember taking him to church with me. And yet I'm so bummed that for me the conversation centered on, are you going to heaven or hell? Not a God who knew about his marriage and knew about his broken heart and knew about his wrecked finances, who has great churches who might help him put those pieces back together. You know, you stop and think about yourself. I mean, why were you able to go 50 years of your life without needing a place like this or a conversation with God? You start, I mean, and I'm not going to ask you to raise hands, but when I just kind of scan in my mind the number of you who this is the first church you've ever had, or if not that, the first church in a long time where you felt connected. Why? Because someone made this impassioned intellectual argument to convince you of something? because the ice skating on the ski hill was so great? I go, why? I'll bet you can summarize it in something as simple as something wasn't going well. I was dealing with something that I didn't feel prepared for. And God, through this place, was helpful. It was just helpful. Andy Stanley in North Point did some research, and I'm summarizing that research to say that I think if I could just suggest this in this middle ground and just grossly oversimplify, but I think appropriately so simplify this whole conversation of when do I and when don't I think you're watching for friends, not projects. People aren't projects, not problems. People aren't problems to be solved either. But you're watching for people who are experiencing one of two things. I just thought this was brilliant insight on their part. Number one, that they're dealing with something that they're not prepared for. That's when the conversation of God becomes relevant. And listen, if he's not insecure about that, if he doesn't feel taken advantage of, then what right do we have to do that for him? I think you're listening for people that are hinting at they weren't prepared for their business failing. They weren't prepared for making this much money. They weren't prepared for this much success. They thought they had marriage all dialed in. Then they got married, and they weren't prepared for marriage to be this hard. They weren't prepared to be parents of 2 kids. I mean, 1, that was easy, but 2, woo. I think you're just watching and suggesting, wait a minute. And listen, if what we're doing around here, both on gathering and scattering, isn't something that could help people consider whether or not God is helpful, then tell us, because we're doing it wrong. So I think we're watching for people who are experiencing something they're not prepared for, or to say it a little bit differently, who are dealing with something that's not going well. Doesn't that simplify it? It's not a box to be checked off. It's not a quota to fill. It's not a question to ask. It's not your job to save people. It's our job to be stewards of his grace and mercy. As Jesus said to the demoniac, just go tell him what God has done for you and how his mercy knows no limits. And see if maybe God doesn't bring people into your life who are overwhelmed. And just suggest, maybe you'd find God to be helpful. Maybe you'd want to check out this church called Narrate. Now listen, this isn't about us, but I'm just trying to deal with what I think is an otherwise toxic view of evangelism, which says that all kinds of things, none of which seem to be all that true, but instead a God who says, just go be a signpost of a God who's helpful. Isn't that what's inspiring about that story that I read you? That a college girl, in grieving the loss of her brother, what she found helpful in that process was God. I was talking to a guy over lunch a couple months ago, and it was hilarious. He was fairly new to this place, and he was telling me that his wife has always gone to church, and he had never, kind of had gone with her intermittently, but hadn't in a long time. And she had said to him a little over a year ago, are you ever going to go to church with me again? And he said, tell you what, these are his words. He said, I'll go to church with you when you find a church that asks more questions than they give answers and meets downtown. So she found us, and they started hanging out here. And he looked at me and he said, you know, Adam, you know what Narrate is to me? And I said, yeah, what is it? And he said, it's a date with my wife. He said, because I come and we bring our daughter, and she has a great experience in the Narrate kids, and I sit up in that balcony most of the time, and we listen to great music and laugh, and then we leave with questions, and we leave having conversations. And he literally said, when I go to a movie with my wife, I don't leave with questions. I don't leave having a conversation. But when I leave here, I leave with stuff to talk about. What is that? I think it's a guy who's discovered that God can be helpful. And along the road to help, there's all kinds of benefits that happen with that. Listen, if you're riddled with guilt, my hope is to relieve some pressure. And at the same time, if you're someone that you're still trying to figure out this Jesus story, listen, the story is that your life can start again. That through believing in Jesus, life can start fresh again. That's the invitation. Let's pray. God, Jesus, I'm so thankful for what you did, starting with that college gal's heart and in her life. And Lord, thankful for so many people who work so hard around here, both during the week and on the weekends, to create experiences that are helpful. God, we don't advertise that we're an evangelical church, but we're proud to be a part of a heritage of people who want to serve people by helping them understand how you can help them through some of life's unexpected difficulties. Many of us, God, it was through our pain that you brought us to our knees. And so, Jesus, we just honor you and say thank you. Amen.
If you would like to engage further with Narrate Church, you can find contact information online, www.narratechurch.org. We would love to hear from you.